The air tonight tastes of iron and ash, and when you open your eyes, you're standing in a land that no longer belongs to its people. Scotland is a bruised body beneath the boot of England, the year a blur of hunger and fear. Villages are hushed, fires burned low not just for warmth, but to avoid notice. You hear the creak of ox carts carrying taxes southward, grain and cattle flowing to Edward I's coffers, while the children of farmers gnaw at bark and weeds. Soldiers patrol narrow tracks, their armour clinking in rhythms that remind you more of a prison chain than of protection. You look at the faces around you, hollow-eyed, silent, always glancing at the ground, because lifting your gaze toward an English garrison might invite punishment. You probably won't survive this walk through 13th century Scotland, but here you are. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments, what city or tiny village are you watching from tonight, and what time is it there? Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step carefully past a field where wheat should stand tall, but instead you see only the blackened stubble left behind by soldiers who scorched the land so rebels couldn't hide in abundance. The English king, Edward Longshanks they call him, a man whose shadow seems to stretch over both Scotland and Wales, rules with precision and cruelty. He does not simply want taxes, he wants obedience carved into the bones of the people. Historians still argue whether Edward's policy was strategy or sadism, but either way, you feel the chill of it in every ruined village. In a tavern, you overhear whispers. Men with calloused hands speak in low tones, eyes darting toward the door. One mutters about the hammer of the Scots, a name Edward wears proudly, as if breaking a people is no different from breaking stone. Another replies that even hammers wear down eventually. They speak of scattered risings, small sparks in the darkness. You can almost feel those sparks brushing against your fingertips, as if rebellion is waiting for someone with the nerve to fan it into flame. And yet you notice something strange in the fear. It never entirely hardens into despair. Mothers still hum lullabies in Scots tongue, as though the rhythm alone is an act of resistance. Young boys carve thistles into the wood of their stools, a symbol of prickly defiance under the English gaze. Even churchyards hold secret meetings, prayers muttered not for the souls of the dead, but for the courage of the living. You press deeper into this uneasy quiet and hear a curious tale, the kind told in the margins of chronicles rather than on official scrolls. Some say that in these years of oppression, ordinary villagers looked for signs in the stars and omens in the flight of birds, hoping to glimpse a destiny beyond English chains. A raven circling thrice above a field could mean rebellion was near. A wolf howl at the edge of a hamlet was believed to signal not danger but protection. These are fringe beliefs, of course, the kind historians hesitate to confirm, yet they reveal something truer than dates and taxes. People needed to believe that fate itself might fight alongside them. As you trudge toward the heart of this land, you begin to sense why Edward's conquest is incomplete. He can torch crops, hang rebels, and build castles that stab into the horizon, but he cannot quite extinguish that stubborn ember glowing in the people's hearts. You catch it in the sideways glance of a girl filling water at the well, in the old songs sung softer but never silenced, and in the stories murmured by travellers who speak of a figure already haunting the borderlands, a man of no great birth, but of great anger, a man the English will learn to fear. That ember has a name, William Wallace, and though he is not yet the roaring flame of legend, tonight, in this hushed and broken Scotland, you feel the first heat of his shadow curling toward you. You hear his name carried like a rumour, half warning and half prayer, Wallace. To the English ear, he's just a minor knight, a man without the weight of noble lineage or estates. To the Scots, though, he begins as something smaller and stranger, a story that flickers out of the dark like a spark no one can quite snuff out. You picture him at first not on a battlefield but slipping through forests and marshes, the son of a lesser family in Elderslie, learning to live off roots and streams, wielding not armies but whatever steel he can lay his hands on. He's not supposed to matter, yet here he is, gathering legend with each defiant act. The first tale you stumble across has the feel of folklore more than history. It says that one evening in Lanark, Wallace snapped after an English officer insulted him. Some versions claim it was over a quarrel about fish in the market, others that the officer killed a woman close to Wallace. Historians still argue whether this moment was myth or spark, but in every telling, Wallace's reaction is the same: sudden, violent, and entirely uncompromising. He slays the man not with the formality of duel, but with the raw fury of a man who has carried humiliation too long. In that instant, he becomes an outlaw, stepping across an invisible line from obedient subject to hunted rebel. From then on, his life is written in ambushes and raids. You trail behind him as he and his companions slip through moonlit glens, their boots sinking into wet moss, their breaths held tight as they stalk an English patrol. When the attack comes, it is swift, all iron and shouts, followed by silence. Wallace doesn't merely kill soldiers, he dismantles their authority. He burns tax records, frees prisoners, sends messages in ash and blood that Scotland is not as conquered as Edward believes. You notice something unusual about his company. It is not filled with polished knights in shining mail, but with farmers, craftsmen, and men who know hunger better than heraldry. Their loyalty isn't bought with titles, it's welded together by shared anger. Wallace carries himself less like a commander issuing orders, and more like a fellow fugitive, someone who bleeds the same when the sword cuts deep. It's why his name spread so quickly. You don't need to be noble to follow him, you only need to be angry enough to risk it all. And as his legend grows, so do the English reprisals. Bounties are placed on his head. Whole villages are punished for harbouring him. You walk through one such hamlet, its cottages burned to husks, its people staring blankly at the sky as if the smoke has stolen their words. Yet even here, amid ruin, someone dares to whisper that Wallace was seen nearby, alive, still fighting. The very effort to crush him only amplifies his myth. Among the whispers you overhear is a curious claim, repeated with the certainty of superstition, that Wallace wore a great two-handed sword taller than a man's chest, capable of splitting an enemy straight through. The weapon is real enough, a claymore of formidable size, but whether he truly wielded it in the way legends describe is another matter. Historians debate whether the weapon was ceremonial, symbolic, or practical in the chaos of raids. Still, in the imagination of his followers, it becomes more than steel. It becomes a symbol of defiance itself, one man's rage forged into a blade too heavy for anyone else to carry. And so you begin to understand why Wallace cannot be ignored. He is not a nobleman jockeying for power. He is an idea stitched into human form. Every insult, every burned village, every Titan tax feeds him, until his name grows larger than his outlaw band. You sense it. Scotland is waiting for him not just to fight, but to lead. And soon enough, that chance will arrive. Because whispers will not remain whispers forever. Armies will gather, banners will rise, and the English, complacent in their confidence, will discover what happens when an ember is given wind. The morning smells of wet rushes and horse sweat, and you find yourself standing on the banks of the River Forth near Stirling. The year is 1297, and Scotland is restless, trembling between despair and rebellion. Across the river, the English army gleams like a sheet of metal under the weak sun. Armoured knights, archers and infantry stretched out in disciplined lines. They outnumber the Scots by thousands, confident that they will once again sweep aside these ragged rebels. You glance at Wallace, now tall in the saddle, his rough mail patched with scars of battle. He does not look like a polished commander from a tapestry. He looks like a man with a plan, and tonight that plan is all that stands between his people and annihilation. The English believe the battle is already theirs. After all, they have wealth, horses and numbers. But Wallace and his ally, Andrew Murray, see something the English overlook: the narrow wooden bridge spanning the Forth. Only a handful of soldiers can cross at a time. To the English, it's just an inconvenience. To Wallace, it's the key to victory. Historians still argue whether the Scots ambushed mid-crossing or waited until a significant portion had advanced, but the result is the same. You watch as the English march onto the bridge, their pride blinding them to the trap. You crouch in the tall grasses with Wallace's men, the river mist curling like smoke around your boots. The tension coils so tightly you can hear your own heartbeat. Then, with a cry that rips through the damp air, the Scots charge. The bridge erupts into chaos. Horses rear, soldiers stumble, and the weight of armoured men turns the planks slick and deadly. The Scots pour in from the slopes, striking fast, cutting down knights before they can form ranks. The sound is not of glorious combat, but of bodies hitting water, of wood cracking under the press of panic. The English line buckles, and you see men drowning beneath the weight of their own armour, dragged under by currents that don't care for crowns or titles. A knight flails, his sword slipping from his grasp as the river claims him. The Scots roar, not in triumph yet, but in disbelief that the impossible is happening. Against overwhelming odds, their fury and cunning turn the tide. Stirling Bridge is no longer just a crossing, it is a coffin for the English pride. You catch sight of Wallace in the melee wielding that great claymore, whether truly practical or not. In this moment, the image of him swinging that massive blade feels real enough, cleaving through the air like a banner of defiance. Around him, the men fight not just with steel, but with the desperation of those who know they are fighting for every acre, every song, every child left behind in villages scorched by English patrols. And then it is over, quicker than anyone expected. The English break. Panic spreads faster than fire on dry straw. Men flee across the bridge, only to be cut down or topple into the water below. The Scots claim the field, and for the first time in living memory, you hear laughter in the aftermath of battle, ragged, hoarse, but triumphant. Wallace and Moray have delivered a victory that should not have been possible. Among the villagers who gather afterward, you overhear a curious detail. Some swear that Wallace had invoked St. Andrew, Scotland's patron, before the charge, raising his sword like a cross. Others insist he cursed the English with the voice of a prophet, calling them to drown as payment for their tyranny. The truth, as always, lies somewhere blurred between miracle and propaganda. What matters is how people believe it. The triumph at Stirling spreads across Scotland like wildfire. For once, the English are not invincible. For once, the Scots see that cunning and terrain can tear apart an empire's might. Wallace's name shifts again, no longer just outlaw, but guardian of Scotland, appointed by acclaim and necessity. And yet, as you stand among the mud and wreckage, you sense a shadow lingering. Victories are intoxicating, but they invite greater enemies. The embers Wallace has fanned into flame will soon face a storm fierce enough to threaten even the brightest blaze. The triumph at Stirling lingers like smoke in your clothes, but victories never stay clean for long. Less than a year later, you find yourself trudging through the churned mud of Falkirk, and this time the air carries a different weight. Not hope, but dread. Edward I has returned, no longer dismissive of the rebels, but determined to stamp them out with overwhelming force. His army is immense, cavalry gleaming in the sunlight, longbowmen poised with lethal patience, and infantry marching in disciplined ranks. Wallace, once the spark that lit rebellion, now faces a storm designed to snuff it out. You watch Wallace position his men in tight circles of spearmen, known as schiltrons, bristling hedgehogs of wood and iron. The tactic is clever, defensive, and terrifying to charge against, and for a moment you believe it might work. When the English cavalry thunder forward, the schiltrons hold. Horses scream, knights topple, and the ground shakes with the violence of the clash. You feel a surge of pride that untrained farmers can resist the charge of England's finest. But then the sky darkens, not with clouds, but with arrows. Edward's Welsh and English longbowmen unleash a rain so dense it seems to blot out the sun. The schiltrons, immovable against cavalry, become easy targets for shafts that pierce through leather, flesh, and bone. You flinch as men fall in clusters, shields rattling like drums. Wallace cannot move them without opening their flanks, and so they endure, bodies piling around them as the storm continues. Historians still argue whether betrayal played a greater role than arrows, whether Scottish nobles, jealous of Wallace's growing stature, deliberately abandoned him mid-battle. But the result is the same. The schiltrons are shredded, the field lost. You step through the carnage after the rout, the stench of blood thick in the air. Wallace himself survives, slipping once more into the shadows, but Moray is dead, and Scotland's fragile unity lies in ruins. The nobles who had briefly tolerated Wallace's rise turn their backs, preferring accommodation with Edward to further rebellion. You see them ride away with polished dignity, leaving the common soldiers to rot where they fell. It is a betrayal sharp enough to cut deeper than any English blade, and yet, even in this bleak aftermath, stories bloom like weeds through stone. You overhear a curious tale told by survivors that Wallace, before retreating, struck down an English knight with such force that the man's horse collapsed beneath him as well, pinned by the weight of its rider's armour. Is it true, or just an invention to salvage dignity from disaster? Historians remain divided, but you realise it hardly matters. In the minds of the beaten Scots, Wallace must remain indestructible, even when all else crumbles. You walk past the wounded, listening to the way they whisper his name as though it is medicine. Wallace will return. Wallace will avenge us. Their faith is unshaken because Wallace represents more than the defeat at Falkirk. He is the reminder that the English can bleed, that resistance is not madness, and even when the nobles forsake him, the people do not. Still, you can feel the shift. The easy laughter that followed Stirling is gone, replaced by a grim silence, the kind that comes when survival feels more important than victory. Wallace himself is no longer guardian of Scotland. He resigns, or is forced to step down, handing the title back to nobles who neither trust nor respect him. You sense the isolation closing around him like a noose. But there is one truth you cannot ignore. Even in failure, Wallace refuses to bend. He does not bow to Edward, he does not seek forgiveness from the crown, and he does not fade into quiet exile. Instead, he becomes something far more dangerous than a defeated commander. He becomes a fugitive with nothing left to lose. The fields of Falkirk may be Edward's triumph, but the story is far from over. You can almost hear Wallace's boots already retreating into the forests, carrying defiance with every step. The forests swallow you now, damp with mist and heavy with silence. After Falkirk, Wallace is no longer a guardian of the realm, but an outlaw, hunted not just by Edward's soldiers, but by his own country's nobles, who find his defiance inconvenient. You follow him down narrow deer tracks, his figure slipping in and out of shadow. He has no castle, no bannered retinue, no halls filled with supporters. What he has instead is stubbornness, an iron refusal to surrender, and a handful of companions loyal enough to risk starvation, ambush, and betrayal. Nights are spent in caves, the smoke from their small fires curling so faintly that it disappears before reaching the treetops. You huddle in the cold, listening to the creak of wet leather and the rasp of blades being sharpened. Wallace shares bread so stale it cracks like stone, washes wounds with stream water, and keeps watch long after the others sleep. He is more ghost than man now, flitting between glens and hills, striking suddenly and vanishing before the English can respond. His raids are smaller now, but no less brutal in their symbolism. A supply caravan disappears in the mist. A sheriff notorious for cruelty is found slain. A garrison wakes to smoke as their outpost burns around them. You hear the English soldiers mutter that Wallace is everywhere and nowhere, a phantom they cannot pin down. The truth is less supernatural and more human. He knows the land, and he has nothing left to fear. That makes him unpredictable, and unpredictability is power. Yet survival exacts its toll. You notice the hollowness in his cheeks, the way he limps after long marches, the deepening lines carved by exhaustion. His companions whisper about dwindling supplies, about the futility of resisting both king and countrymen. Still, when Wallace speaks, his voice carries that same fire as before, low, steady, unwilling to bend. He tells them Scotland cannot live on its knees. The words sound rehearsed, like armour he wears against despair. In villages, his name still sparks quiet defiance. A miller's daughter swears she saw him pass through at dusk, blessing the family with his presence. A blacksmith claims Wallace's claymore was forged with iron smelted under a blood moon, giving it unearthly strength. Historians still argue whether Wallace himself spread these stories to keep hope alive, or whether the people embroidered them on their own. But either way, you see how legend begins to outweigh fact. Wallace the man hides in caves, Wallace the myth marches freely in the open, and then comes a curious tidbit, one you overhear from a friar tending to villagers. Some insist Wallace journeyed briefly to France during this fugitive period, seeking support from the French king against Edward. The evidence is debated, hazy in the records, yet the thought is tantalising. Imagine him slipping across the channel, a ragged outlaw petitioning courts filled with silk and gold. Whether or not it happened, the rumour shows how wide his shadow stretches. But shadows are fragile things. Every day as you move through the woods you sense the net tightening. The English offer rewards so heavy that betrayal begins to gleam more brightly than loyalty. Friends eye each other uneasily, wondering who might sell a name, a location, a path through the trees. You realise that Wallace is not just running from soldiers, he is running from hunger, from doubt, from the endless erosion of trust. Still, When the dawn breaks over the hills and the mist curls like smoke from the earth, Wallace mounts his horse once more. His cloak is ragged, his boots caked with the mud, but his resolve remains intact. He is the ember that refuses to die, flickering even when the wind howls strongest. For now he lives, for now he fights. But in the distance, faint as a drumbeat, you hear the footsteps of betrayal closing in. The forest path twists into betrayal, and you can almost feel the weight of silver coins clinking in someone else's purse. Wallace's years as a fugitive cannot last forever. Even the strongest ember eventually risks being stamped out not by soldiers but by treachery. You watch as the tension mounts, every companion's glance sharper than it should be, every silence in the night camp stretched too long. Trust, once his last weapon, begins to rot. The betrayal comes not on a battlefield but in a quiet moment, and that is what makes it sting all the more. Wallace is seized near Glasgow, some say at Rob Royston, handed over by a Scottish knight who once swore loyalty but found English silver more persuasive. Historians still argue the exact details, whether Sir John Menteith acted of his own will or under orders, but to the people, the story is simple. Scotland sold its hero. You stand there as the English close in, shackles clinking like cruel applause, and Wallace does not resist. Perhaps he knows resistance is useless. Perhaps he's simply too tired to run anymore. They bind him in chains, the cold iron biting into his skin, and you sense how quickly freedom can be stolen. For years, Wallace moved like smoke, ungraspable, intangible, but now he is solid, a body caged in iron. You follow as they drag him from the familiar hills into the harsh, hostile towns that will never speak his name with reverence. His captors jeer, calling him traitor, outlaw, murderer. They spit at him, laugh at him, parade him like a trophy. And through it all, Wallace keeps his head high, his silence sharper than any retort. In one town you overhear villagers arguing. One man insists Wallace deserves his fate, that his rebellion brought nothing but ruin. Another spits back that Wallace stood when no one else would. Their voices rise until soldiers silence them with the blunt end of a spear. The debate may be hushed, but it lingers in the air, an open question of loyalty and betrayal, still echoing across centuries. A curious detail trickles through these towns, passed along in whispers. Some claim Wallace, even in chains, refused to eat English bread, demanding only food from Scottish hands. Was this stubborn pride, or a symbolic protest to the end? Historians cannot agree, but you imagine him spitting out crumbs of foreign wheat, even in captivity, still clinging to the notion of sovereignty. Each mile southward feels heavier, the road stretching into a kind of living execution. This is not simply a march, it is humiliation stretched across the countryside. The English do not merely want to kill Wallace, they want to unmake him, to parade him as proof that rebellion is futile. Every insult hurled at him is not just for his ears, but for Scotland's. This is what happens to those who resist, the message hums, carried on the wind. And yet something strange happens along this brutal road. The people who glimpse Wallace do not always see a broken man. Some see defiance in the way he carries himself, shoulders square despite the chains. Some see martyrdom already taking shape, as though death is not his defeat but his coronation. You sense how myth builds in real time. Every jeer from the English is matched by a whispered prayer from the Scots, every insult by a promise of vengeance. When night falls, and you lie awake beside the creak of chains, you realise the betrayal that captured Wallace has birthed something unintended. By handing him to the English, his enemies may have stripped him of freedom, but they have also placed him on a stage larger than any battlefield. His end will not be quiet, his suffering will not be forgotten. The silver coins clatter in the dark, but you know the sound that will outlast them, the echo of Wallace's name still burning even in captivity. The road south stretches endlessly, each step dragging Wallace farther from the hills that once sheltered him. You walk alongside the column of soldiers as they escort him through hostile towns, his body bound in chains, his dignity left deliberately exposed for ridicule. This is not simply transportation, it is theatre, a calculated parade designed to break not only Wallace, but the idea of Scotland's defiance itself. You hear boots strike the cobblestones in rhythm, the iron links rattling like a grim drumbeat. Every village and city along the way becomes part of the spectacle. Crowds gather, eager for the sight of the man who once dared to challenge Edward I. Children perch on shoulders, merchants abandon stalls, women peek nervously from doorways. Some spit and curse, shouting "traitor" in voices too loud to be casual. Others, quieter, press their hands to their hearts or whisper a prayer as he passes. You sense how perception splits. To the English he is a warning, to many Scots he is already something closer to a martyr. The soldiers take pleasure in the humiliation. They force Wallace to ride not as a knight, but strapped and bound like cargo, sometimes tied to the tail of a horse, stumbling as the beast jerks forward. His body bears the marks of rough handling, bruises blooming on his arms, wrists raw from iron clasps, and yet you notice how he carries himself. His head does not sag. His eyes, shadowed but steady, still sweep across the crowds as though memorizing every face. A curious story follows him on this journey, whispered in alehouses and marketplaces. Some say that when the soldiers mocked his ragged clothing, Wallace answered coolly that a man's honour lies not in silk but in his courage. Whether the words are fact or embellishment, the effect is the same. Even in chains he refuses to be reduced to shame. Historians still debate whether Wallace spoke defiantly during this march or kept mostly silent, but the contradiction itself shows how legend and reality began to intertwine before he ever reached London. The march itself is a study in contrasts. By day the crowds jeer and the soldiers laugh, but by night silence hangs thick over the camp. You lie in the grass near the fire listening to men grumble about their orders. Some are uneasy, claiming that Wallace's calm unnerves them more than any sword he once wielded. A soldier mutters that executing him will only breed more rebellion, only to be hushed by his comrades. The debate crackles in the dark, unresolved, heavy as smoke. When the procession finally reaches the outskirts of London, the city sprawls before you like a beast of stone and timber, its walls looming, its streets already crowded with the curious. News of Wallace's capture has travelled ahead, and anticipation churns like a festival, though one built on cruelty rather than joy. You can smell roasted meat from vendors mingling with the stink of refuse, hear laughter layered with the clang of blacksmiths, and feel the tremor of a populace hungry for spectacle. And there, in the midst of it all, Wallace rides on, chained and battered, but unmistakably alive. His very presence electrifies the air, polarizing the crowd into mockery and reverence. You feel it in your bones. This is no longer just the journey of a prisoner, it is the prelude to a performance the English crown has carefully staged, where suffering will be the central act. Yet as you look at Wallace, shoulders squared even under the crushing weight of iron, you can't shake the thought that perhaps Edward has made a mistake. By dragging him across the kingdom as a trophy, he has given every witness a story to pass on, and stories, once unleashed, cannot be chained. The streets of London thrum like a hive when Wallace arrives, the summer air buzzing with anticipation. You drift into the tide of bodies pressing toward Westminster Hall, where the trial is to be held. The hall itself towers with cold grandeur, its vaulted beams stretching like ribs over a chamber designed for judgment as much as spectacle. Wallace is dragged inside, chains clanking with every step, and the crowd surges forward, eager for a glimpse. This is not justice. It is theatre, choreographed cruelty under Edward's stern gaze. The charges are read aloud in booming tones: treason, murder, rebellion. The words hang heavy in the air, meant to weigh down Wallace's very soul, but you catch the irony immediately. Treason against a king he never swore allegiance to. Wallace was a subject of the Scottish crown, not England's. The logic is laughable, and you sense the ripple of unease even among the crowd. Historians still argue whether Edward's court cared at all about truth, or whether the trial was purely ceremonial, but the outcome was always written before the ink dried. When Wallace is asked to respond, silence fills the chamber like a tide withdrawing from the shore. Then, with a voice that cuts through the echoing hall, he speaks. "I could not be a traitor, for I was never Edward's subject." The words slice deeper than any blade, and for a fleeting moment you feel the room tremble. It is not the defence of a man begging for mercy, but the defiance of someone who refuses to bow, even at the edge of death. The judges do not deliberate. They do not weigh evidence or testimony. The sentence is already sealed. Wallace is to be executed in the most brutal way possible, dragged through the streets, hanged, and then dismembered as a warning to all who might dream of freedom. You feel the air grow colder as the words are pronounced. a collective shiver rolling through the spectators. The hall does not roar with approval. It hums with a more sinister energy, the anticipation of blood. You notice Wallace's face in that moment. It is not blank despair, but something quieter, almost detached, as if he has already stepped beyond fear. Perhaps he knew this fate awaited him from the moment he raised his first sword. Perhaps he even welcomes it, knowing his death will speak louder than any raid ever could. And yet there are whispers tucked beneath the official noise. A friar mutters that Wallace confessed his sins with calm dignity, preparing his soul. Another swears he spat defiantly at the judges, refusing their authority altogether. Historians still debate which version is closer to truth. The uncertainty itself feels important, because legend and reality are already blurring, one feeding the other until Wallace becomes something more than a man. When the trial ends, the crowd spills back into the streets, voices buzzing, vendors hawking food as though this is a festival rather than a march toward execution. You can almost taste the strange mix of horror and entertainment, the way humans so easily turn suffering into spectacle. A child tugs at his mother's sleeve, asking what Wallace did wrong, and the mother hesitates before answering. Even in this city of enemies, doubt creeps into the edges of certainty. As the guards drag Wallace away, you linger on the echo of his words. I was never Edward's subject. They will not appear in the official record, but they will live in the whispered memory of every witness who felt their sting. And you realise that the English crown, in trying to silence him, has given him the loudest stage of all. The trial is over. The judgment is clear. But the ordeal, the part history cannot look away from, still waits outside under the open sky. The morning breaks grey and heavy, as though the sky itself knows what is about to unfold. You find yourself pressed into the throng along the streets of London, where Wallace is dragged from the tower towards Smithfield. He is not allowed the dignity of walking freely. Instead, he is tied to a hurdle, a wooden frame pulled by horses through the mud and filth of the city. His body jolts with every rut in the road, scraping against the ground, while jeers rain down from the crowd. This is not merely execution, it is humiliation stretched into hours, designed to erode him piece by piece before the killing blow is ever struck. The smell of the streets clings to your throat, offal, dung, smoke and sweat. Vendors shout as though it were market day, selling ale and bread to spectators who treat death as spectacle. Some wave flags, others point and laugh, children perched on shoulders for a better view. And through it all, Wallace endures, his face bloodied, his body bruised, yet his silence sharper than any curse. You notice that silence gnaws at the crowd more than defiance ever could. A man who will not scream feels larger than the chains that bind him. At Smithfield, the real ordeal begins. Wallace is stripped and hung from a gallows, but not to the point of death. He dangles, gasping, until his body convulses with the desperate fight for breath. Then he is cut down, still alive. You watch as the executioners proceed with the method reserved for traitors: disembowelment, mutilation, and quartering. The details blur between history and legend, and historians still argue which parts are fact, which are embellishment meant to harden his martyrdom. Yet one thing is certain. This was designed not just to kill Wallace, but to erase his humanity, to turn him into an object lesson in agony. And yet, even here, in the darkest theatre of cruelty, fragments of resistance glimmer. One chronicler notes that Wallace never begged for mercy, never gave Edward the satisfaction of submission. Another insists he cried out to God, turning his torment into testimony of faith. Still another whispers that he remained silent, his defiance echoing louder than screams ever could. No matter which version is true, the essence is the same. Wallace's spirit endured where his body could not. When it's over, his head is severed and set upon London Bridge, a grisly warning to all who cross the Thames. His limbs are scattered to Newcastle, Berwick, Perth and Stirling. Carved pieces of a man transformed into a macabre map of empire. The English intend this dispersal to erase him, to turn him into fragments unworthy of remembrance. But you realise, as the crowd disperses and the sun finally breaks through the clouds, that the opposite has happened. Every limb, every relic of suffering becomes a seed of memory planted in the soil of rebellion. You linger on a curious story that trickles out afterward. Some swear that a fragment of Wallace's skin was preserved by an executioner, fashioned into a relic of cruelty. Others dismiss it as grotesque legend. A tale too lurid to believe? Historians remain divided, but the rumour itself tells you something vital. Wallace's death was so horrifying that people needed stories, however strange, to process it. Facts could never carry the full weight of what happened that day. The English crown achieved its immediate aim. Wallace was gone, his rebellion crushed. Yet, as you stand there amid the dispersing crowd, you sense how Edward may have miscalculated. By making Wallace's death a spectacle, he ensured it would be remembered. By tearing Wallace's body into pieces, he scattered his legend into every corner of the land. You close your eyes, the noise of the city fading, and realise that this execution, meant to extinguish rebellion, has instead enshrined it. Wallace's body may lie in fragments, but his name will march on, larger now than ever before. The crowd eventually disperses, but the echoes of Wallace's execution linger in the air like smoke that refuses to clear. You wander through London's streets, hearing fragments of conversation, some mocking, others uneasy, all touched by the spectacle they witnessed. And as you retrace the long road back north in your mind, you realise that Wallace's story does not end with his body on a scaffold. It begins again in whispers, carried by merchants, pilgrims and soldiers, until Scotland itself hums with the tale of his defiance. Back home, villages speak of him not as a defeated outlaw, but as a man too proud to bow. Children repeat his final words, whether they were prayer, curse, or silence, each retelling shaping him into the image they most need. The nobles may have abandoned him, but the common people carry his memory like contraband, hidden in songs and stories. And soon, those stories transform into something greater, the foundation of a national identity. Historians still argue whether Wallace's rebellion truly altered Edward's grip on Scotland, or whether his death was simply another stone on the road to later victories. But you feel the truth in the way the people remember him. Fact may waver, but legacy endures. His martyrdom plants seeds in unlikely soil. Robert the Bruce, once a man who shifted loyalties with the wind, rises years later to continue the struggle, perhaps steeled by Wallace's example. Generations afterward, poets and chroniclers will dress Wallace in myth, making his claymore taller, his speeches bolder, his courage flawless. You can almost hear the scratching of quills centuries later, weaving him into the fabric of Scottish identity. The flesh and blood knight fades, but the ghost of Wallace only grows. Curious tidbits bloom in the centuries that follow. One legend insists that Wallace's sword was so immense it was preserved and passed down as a relic, though historians debate whether the weapon displayed today in Stirling truly belonged to him. Another tale claims Wallace visited saints in dreams of future rebels, blessing their cause with his eternal presence. These are fringe stories, embroidered by time, but they show how desperately people clung to his defiance, needing it to be larger than life. And when you stand before the great monuments, like the National Wallace Monument, rising from the crags above Stirling, you feel how his execution, meant to erase him, became the very reason for his immortality. His death was grotesque, cruel, designed to terrify. Instead, it turned him into Scotland's eternal ghost of resistance, a figure who still haunts the imagination of those who hate chains. The torchlit halls of Westminster may have claimed his life, but the fields, the glens, and the songs of Scotland claimed his soul. And as the centuries roll forward, his shadow stretches long, reminding every generation that freedom, however fragile, is worth defiance, even when it costs everything. You stand there at the edge of this story, the image of Wallace's last moments etched into your mind, and you realise, Edward won his battle, but Scotland won a ghost, and ghosts have a way of outlasting kings. Now the story softens, and the harsh edges of iron and fire begin to fade. The streets of London grow quiet, the jeers of the crowd dissolving into the hush of night. You can almost imagine Wallace's chains falling away, the weight lifting, the pain gone. What remains is not the cruelty of his death, but the resilience of his spirit, gentle now, like a lantern glowing in the dark. Let yourself drift back from the scaffold, from the noise of history into a calmer space. Picture the hills of Scotland in summer, their slopes green and rolling, rivers glittering like ribbons in the light. There is no battle here, no crown, no sword, only the steady hum of bees in the heather and the distant call of birds. The world feels slower, softer, as if even memory has chosen to rest. Breathe in, let the story dissolve into silence. Wallace's struggle is over. His fight has been told and retold, but for you tonight, it can fade into stillness. Rest in the knowledge that history, however dark, always drifts into peace. And as the last flickers of candlelight dim, let sleep take you gently,